I stood in front of my father's grave, staring at the polished stone that bore his name. He had been the CEO of a major company, a man of influence and power. But now, all that remained of him was buried beneath the earth. After his passing, my brother-in-law, Grant, stepped into his shoes. He didn't just inherit the company. He walked away with a staggering $500 million. And me? I was left with nothing but an old mini truck. Grant, never one to miss an opportunity to gloat, smirked as he looked at me. Well, Ethan, I've got the company and the entire estate in my hands. That little truck suits you just fine. His voice dripped with mockery. But to me, that mini truck wasn't just an old vehicle. It was something more. I ran my fingers along the worn-out steering wheel, lost in thought. When I finally turned the key, the engine hummed to life, and something unusual caught my eye. A destination was already programmed into the navigation system. What's this? I muttered, frowning at the screen. There was no name, no familiar address, just a set of coordinates leading somewhere unknown. I hesitated for a moment, then tightened my grip on the wheel. Whatever this was, I was about to find out. Hello, everyone. My name is Ethan, and I'm 45 years old. Right now, I'm standing before a massive coffin, staring at the final resting place of my father. Our relationship had always been complicated. He was a man who built a construction empire from nothing, a man who lived and breathed his work. But I chose a different road. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to teach. So after finishing college, I left home to chase that dream. My decision didn't sit well with him. We fought, argued until we had nothing left to say. After that, we barely spoke. Still, I never hated him. I had my own path to walk, even if it meant disappointing him. But that guilt, it never really left me. As the eldest son, I felt like I had a duty to take over the family business, to be the man he wanted me to be. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to do it. That guilt kept me away from home. My mother, bless her heart, kept me updated through my sister, Lillian. She and Grant would send expensive gifts to my father for birthdays and anniversaries, pretending they were from me. Every time, Lillian would call me and say, "I wish you and Dad could talk. He's just being stubborn, but deep down, he must feel lonely." I'd listen, nod along, and then push it all aside. I wasn't ready to face him. Then, one day I got the call. My father had cancer. The moment I heard the news, I dropped everything. I quit my job, packed my bags, and went straight home. Because suddenly, all the fights, all the distance, it didn't matter anymore. When I walked through the front door, my father's face froze in shock. But he didn't push me away. He didn't say much at all. And so I stayed. I took care of him. I helped where I could, made sure he was comfortable. He didn't say much, but every now and then, he'd look at me and whisper, "Thank you." Those two words meant more than I ever could have imagined. But no matter how much I wished for more time, the end came. He passed away with me, Lillian, and my mother by his side. We had no way of knowing what was on his mind in those final moments. We could only hope he had found peace. Even though we had seen it coming, the loss hit us hard. My mother, Lillian, even my young nephew, Noah, wept for him. The only one who seemed completely unaffected was Grant. While we were in the middle of the funeral preparations, he casually asked, "So, he finally died, huh?" I clenched my fists but kept my cool. There was no point in losing my temper with Grant. Instead, I threw myself into making sure my father's funeral was done right. It kept my hands busy, kept my mind from sinking into the weight of grief. Grant and I had never been close, but after my father's death, the tension between us reached a new level. I first met him years ago when he was just a skilled worker at my father's company. Back then, I respected him. He had real talent, a sharp mind. When he married my sister, I even saw him as an older brother. He was 5 years ahead of me, and in those early years, I looked up to him. I would ask him for advice about life, and he always gave me thoughtful answers. I remember one conversation in particular, one about whether I should take over the family business. "You have your own life to live, Ethan," he told me. "No one knows which choices are the right ones. The only thing that matters is making choices you won't regret." His words gave me the push I needed to follow my dream. I switched from studying business management to education, the field I had always wanted. Looking back now, I wonder, was he really giving me honest advice? Or was he just making sure I stayed out of his way? As the years passed, Grant and Lillian built a life together as husband and wife. 22 years came and went, and during that time, the gap between my father and me only grew wider. I carried on with my own life, never realizing how much time had slipped away, how many chances I had lost to mend what was broken between us. Then, one day, everything changed. I got the news that my father was seriously ill. Without hesitation, I dropped everything, packed my bags, and went straight home. Grant, who used to greet me with warmth, was different now. The moment I stepped back into the house, I could sense the shift. He seemed uneasy around me, as if my presence disrupted something he had settled into. When we were alone, he looked me in the eye and spoke with a cold smirk. "You sure rushed back fast when you heard he was sick, didn't you?" he said. "But don't get any ideas. No matter what you do, you're not getting a piece of the inheritance." His words blindsided me. For a second, I was too stunned to speak. When I finally found my voice, I asked, "What are you talking about?" Grant scoffed, shaking his head. "Come on, don't play dumb. Maybe it's just a coincidence that you showed up now, but if you think this changes anything, you're wrong. The next leader of the company has already been decided." His tone was sharp, almost taunting. My frustration bubbled over, and before I could stop myself, my voice rose. "No, that's not why I came back. I realized I wasn't a good son, and I just wanted to make things right with Dad before it was too late." Grant waved me off like I was some character in a cheap soap opera. "Spare me the sentimental speeches. That sounds like something straight out of a TV drama. Lillian's into that stuff, but I don't buy it. Let me guess, those fancy gifts you sent were just a way to score points with him?" "That's not true," I shot back. I wanted him to believe me, but I could see it in his eyes. He had already made up his mind. There was no convincing him otherwise. And the worst part? His words weren't just a slap at me. They were a dig at Lillian too. For the first time, I felt a real distance between us, like we weren't just in different rooms, but living in completely separate worlds. After that conversation, my resentment toward Grant only grew. He started mocking me openly, taking every chance he could to remind me where he thought I belonged. "Give it up, Ethan," he'd sneer. "No matter how much you try to get in his good graces, that ship sailed a long time ago. Go back to your little classroom and deal with your troubled students." At first, I let his words get under my skin. I wondered if other people saw me the way he did. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Grant wasn't concerned about our father at all. He was only worried about himself. I started seeing things more clearly. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke about our father, it was all starting to make sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that Grant had married Lillian for the connections, not for love. His ties to our family gave him access to my father's company and wealth, and now that Dad was sick, he barely bothered to visit. He didn't lift a finger to help take care of him. All I could do was push forward and do my best to protect what my father had built. Meanwhile, Grant played his part well. On the surface, he looked polished and professional, but in reality, he was just avoiding responsibility. Most weekends, he was out on the golf course, always claiming it was for business. But when it came to his own home, he barely did a thing. He talked a big game about preparing his son to one day take over the company, yet he left all the real work, parenting, household chores, to Lillian. Whenever she showed the slightest frustration, Grant would grab her hands, look her in the eye, and say, "I'm doing all of this for our family. Now's the time to push forward, no matter the cost. We have to get through this together." And just like that, she'd give in. I could see the doubt in her face, but she always nodded, even when it was clear she wanted to protest. Grant knew exactly how to keep up the image of a devoted husband. To everyone else, he looked like the perfect man. But when it was just the two of us, I saw something different. He never bothered with the act around me, probably because he assumed I was just like him. After a while, I got used to his jabs. They didn't sting as much anymore. But when our father finally passed, the weight of it hit me hard. Grief settled in, deep and heavy. And yet, when I looked at Grant, I couldn't shake the gut-wrenching feeling that he had been waiting for this moment. That thought filled me with a sadness I couldn't put into words, and, beneath it, a quiet rage. Then came the will. Grant, the man who had married into our family, inherited nearly everything. The company, the estate, the money. Even though he was just a son-in-law, my father's will gave him equal rights to the inheritance alongside Lillian and me. When the lawyer read the details, I sat there, speechless. I had always assumed the inheritance would be split evenly between the three of us. But that wasn't what happened at all. Grant got almost everything. And me? I was left with a single item, my father's old mini truck. In public, Grant had the nerve to act surprised, playing the part of a man caught off guard. But when we were alone, he couldn't hide his amusement. "You really came all the way from the city just to take care of Dad, huh?" He chuckled, day and night by his side. "And all you have to show for it is this beat-up little truck. Life sure is funny, isn't it?" I didn't respond. I just held the keys in my hand, the cold metal pressing against my palm. Grant strolled out of the room with a smirk, completely satisfied with how things had played out. And me? I just stood there, gripping the keys a little tighter, trying to make sense of it all. Grant leaned against the doorframe, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Well, the company is mine now, and all you got was that old mini truck. Feels like a joke, doesn't it?" With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in silence. I looked down at the truck keys in my hand, gripping them tightly. The cool metal pressed into my palm, a stark reminder of the reality I was now facing. My father had built an empire, and somehow, nearly all of it had landed in Grant's hands. My family tried to comfort me. "Keep your chin up, Ethan. Dad had his reasons," they said. "He didn't want to hurt you. That truck, it was his favorite. He must have wanted you to have it for a reason." I listened, but I couldn't find the words to respond. It wasn't about the money. I didn't care about wealth. What stung the most was watching my father's entire legacy, everything he had poured his life into, fall into the hands of someone like Grant. A man who had barely lifted a finger to help him in his final days. A man who, deep down, I suspected had been waiting for this moment. I felt powerless, but there was one thing I could do. I could take care of the only thing my father had left me. That old mini truck. Something about it felt significant, like it carried a meaning I hadn't yet understood. Maybe by tending to it, I could make sense of everything that had happened. Maybe I'd find some clarity. I grabbed a hose and started washing the truck, carefully scrubbing away the layers of dust and grime. Once it was clean, I climbed into the driver's seat, the same seat my father had sat in so many times before. I turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. But as I glanced at the dashboard, something strange caught my eye. The navigation system was on. And not just that, it already had a route set. A thick blue line stretched across the screen, pointing to a specific destination. "That's weird," I muttered to myself. "Why is there a route programmed in?" Usually, the navigation only did that when someone had actively set a course. But when I checked the details, there wasn't an address, just a set of coordinates. The estimated drive time? About an hour. Curiosity got the better of me. I figured, if nothing else, it'd be a good excuse to take the truck for a spin. So I shifted into first gear, pulled out of the driveway, and started driving. The road stretched out ahead of me, peaceful and quiet. The hum of the truck's engine was oddly soothing. An hour later, I arrived at an unfamiliar place, a small, modest house standing alone. It wasn't like the large homes I was used to seeing in my hometown. It had a simple charm, the kind of warmth that made it feel lived in, loved. I stepped out of the truck, looking around. The place was eerily silent, no signs or markings to tell me what it was or why I had been led here. But something told me I hadn't come all this way for nothing. With a bit of hesitation, I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. A few moments passed. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. And there, standing in the doorway, was the last person I expected to see. "Mom." She smiled softly. "I've been waiting for you, Ethan. Come in, dear." I blinked, completely thrown off. "Mom, what are you doing here? And why was this place programmed into Dad's navigation system?" She stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "I'll explain everything. But first, come inside and relax." I followed her in, still trying to process what was happening. The house was just as simple inside as it was outside. No extravagant decorations, no unnecessary clutter, just the essentials. A quiet, cozy place. Mom made some tea and sat across from me, her voice calm as she began to explain. "This," she said, looking around, "was your father's secret hideout." I frowned. "His what?" She nodded. "He never mentioned it to you, did he? This was our little escape. Whenever things got overwhelming, whenever we needed space or time to think, we'd come here. If we ever had a disagreement, we had a rule. We'd come here to cool off instead of arguing at home." I leaned back, stunned. I had no idea this place even existed, let alone that it had been such a meaningful part of my parents' lives. Mom reached for something beside her and handed me a brown envelope. It was thick, slightly heavy, like it held something important inside. "This," she said gently, "is something your father wanted you to have." I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. My hands trembled slightly as I began to read. "Ethan, I know I've made things hard for you. Over the years, I've put you through struggles you never deserved. For that, I'm truly sorry. Your mother often reminds me that you had the right to choose your own path, that it was never my decision to make. I was too stubborn to see it at the time, and because of that, I pushed you away. But when you came back after I got sick, it meant the world to me. I didn't know how to say it, but I was grateful. Even if I never said it out loud, I appreciated everything you did. I hope you know that." The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. It was the first time I had ever heard my father speak like this. Openly, honestly. I swallowed hard and kept reading. "There's something else I need to tell you. It's about Grant." I exhaled slowly, gripping the letter a little tighter. Whatever was written next, I had a feeling it would change everything. The truth is, my distrust of Grant had only grown over the years. He had a way with words, the kind of charm that could put people at ease. But beneath that smooth talk, I could see who he really was. I had long suspected that his sneaky behavior around the house was his way of slowly laying claim to things that weren't his. Back then, I was too exhausted from work and the daily grind of taking care of my family to pay close attention to his manipulations. But now, looking back, I knew my instincts had been right all along. I turned my eyes back to the letter in my hands and kept reading. "I never intended to leave the company to you, but in case something unexpected happened, I made sure to set aside a significant amount of money and entrusted it to your mother. This way, you and Lillian will always be taken care of. Please accept it." I lowered the letter and looked at my mom. She didn't say a word, just glanced down at the brown envelope she had handed me. Slowly, I reached for it, opened it, and checked what was inside. Everything was in her name. Then, for the first time since I arrived, she spoke, her voice firm and steady. "If I were to transfer these accounts directly to you and Lillian, it would be considered a taxable gift," she explained. "And if this money had been mentioned in the will, Grant would have found a way to take it. Your father gave this to me while he was still alive, knowing exactly what Grant was capable of. He wanted to make sure it stayed out of his reach. Now, I want to pass it on to you and Lillian as a living gift." I listened, but it still took me a moment to grasp the weight of what she was saying. Then, I looked down at the account book she had placed in front of me. The number on the page stunned me. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life, more than I had ever imagined having. But what truly hit me wasn't the amount. It was the meaning behind it. For years, I had convinced myself that my father only saw Grant as his successor, that he had put all his faith in him and left me behind. But this showed me something different. It was his way of taking care of me, his way of making sure I was never left out. I went back to the letter, my eyes scanning over the last lines. "I entrusted all of this to your mother because I wanted to thank you for everything you've done, for every gift you gave me, in ways you probably didn't even realize. And for that, I am truly grateful." Before I knew it, tears were spilling down my face. I wiped at them, but they kept coming. For the longest time, I believed my father had never really understood me, that we had spent too many years apart for him to ever see me for who I was. But I had been wrong. He had always known. He had always cared. Maybe that's why he left me the mini truck. Because he knew I would see its value. that I wouldn't just brush it off as some old junk, but cherish it, just like he did. I turned to my mom, my voice thick with emotion. I wish I could have done more for him. She gave me a gentle smile, the kind only a mother can give. Ethan, she said softly, it's natural to feel that way when you lose a parent. But don't doubt for a second that you brought him happiness. You showed him love in the way that mattered most. You were his greatest pride. That only made me cry harder. But as painful as it was, her words planted something inside me. A quiet, determined resolve. I wouldn't let Grant destroy what my father had built. I refused to stand by while he ran the company into the ground. So I made a decision right then and there. I would resist, but I'd do it in silence, planning carefully. I wouldn't let Grant suspect that I had resources of my own. The first thing I did was reach out to the company's senior executives, the men my father had trusted the most. They had worked alongside him for years, and they were just as invested in his legacy as I was. To my relief, they were willing to support me. Their reactions told me something I hadn't expected. My father had never spoken badly about me. While I was preparing my plan, my mother and sister played their own role. During the reading of the will, they made sure Grant's attention was focused elsewhere. They acted as if nothing had changed, as if they had no reason to suspect anything. And Grant, he fell for it completely. He thought he had won. One afternoon, he sauntered up to me with that same smug expression he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. Hey you, he sneered. You're still hanging around here? You really don't get it, do you? Dad abandoned you. Left you with nothing. Just accept it already and move on. He waved a dismissive hand at me, as if shooing away a stray dog. I'm the president now. Face reality and go back to whatever pathetic life you had before. I didn't respond. I just looked at him. Let him talk. Let him believe he had won. But deep down, I knew his arrogance would be his downfall. After taking over the company, Grant's ego inflated to an unbearable level. His new title made him reckless. He barely showed up to work, spent his days looking down on people, and treated the employees with open disrespect. It didn't take long for cracks to form. Skilled workers, people who had been loyal to my father for decades, started quitting. But Grant wasn't bothered. If anything, he was even more smug. Anyone who doesn't understand my vision isn't needed here, he announced at a company meeting. If they can't keep up, they're free to leave. He didn't listen to advice. He didn't care about the consequences. And he had no idea that, behind the scenes, I was preparing to take back everything he had stolen. As things spiraled out of control at the company, Grant was too busy indulging himself to notice. He burned through money like it was endless, surrounding himself with luxury while his interest in the business faded. It was hard to believe this was the same man I had once respected, the same man my father had trusted. When I first met him, Grant had been sharp, hard-working, even admirable. What had changed? What had turned him into this reckless, power-hungry man? At home, my mother wept every night, doing her best to keep her pain hidden from the children. She had watched my father build this company from nothing, and now, under Grant's leadership, it was crumbling. I couldn't stand by any longer. I had to do something. I planned carefully, making sure every move was calculated. Then, finally, the day came. I left the house early that morning, heading straight to the office. When Grant strolled into the president's office, expecting another day of unchecked power, he froze. His eyes locked onto me, sitting in his chair, waiting. His expression twisted with rage. What the hell do you think you're doing? Why are you in my seat? Somebody get this man out of here. I didn't flinch. I met his glare and spoke evenly. The one who should be leaving is you. Grant scoffed, shaking his head as if I'd lost my mind. You're joking, right? What are you even talking about? He looked at me like I was nothing more than an annoying pest. I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm but firm. Using the assets our father left us, I bought the majority of the company's shares. We held an emergency shareholders meeting, and as of today, you've been officially removed as president. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across Grant's face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Wait, what? He finally stammered, his voice shaking. No, this can't be right. I kept my eyes on him. I now control 2/3 of the company's shares, Grant. You thought my inheritance was just an old mini truck, but you underestimated me. That truck led to something much bigger than you ever imagined." Grant's jaw clenched. He tried to dig for answers, desperate to understand how things had slipped through his fingers, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of an explanation. Instead, I steered the conversation elsewhere, which only fueled his frustration. "The game is over," I told him, standing up. "Pack your things and leave." I slid a stack of papers across the desk. He grabbed them with trembling hands, scanning through them, his face growing paler with each line he read. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. I folded my arms. "Those are the official records from the shareholders' meeting. And that one on top? That's your termination notice." Grant's face twisted in fury. He crumpled the papers in his fist and slammed them down. "You think this will hold up? I'll take legal action." "Go right ahead," I replied coolly. "We have plenty of justification for our decision." Grant sneered, desperate to find an angle. "Oh, I get it. You've just been after Dad's wealth all along. You think you can take his company out of jealousy? That's all this is." I shook my head. "Grant, let me ask you something. Have you been using company funds for your own personal expenses? Signing leasing agreements that benefit only you?" His expression shifted. For a brief second, panic flashed in his eyes. "And what if I have?" he shot back, his voice quieter now. "What's it to you?" His confidence wavered, and I could tell he was rattled. "How did you find out about that?" he mumbled, his bravado crumbling as I began listing his wrongdoings. "Taking home company property, using corporate funds for personal purchases, computers, TVs, supplies. All of it conveniently ending up at your house instead of here in the office." Grant fumbled for an excuse, but the color drained from his face. He knew he had been caught. "Why? How do you even know about that?" he stuttered, his lips trembling. I didn't break eye contact. "You got too comfortable, Grant. You thought no one was watching, that no one would dare challenge you. You let arrogance cloud your judgment." Over time, I had been gathering evidence with the help of my father's most trusted executives. After Dad's passing, Grant's ego had only grown. At first, he kept up appearances, at least pretending to be a responsible leader. But soon enough, he stopped trying altogether. He dumped his work onto others, slept in his office, disrespected employees who had once been loyal to my father. It didn't take long for the company to suffer. Many skilled workers, frustrated by his leadership, began walking away. Grant was aware of the growing issues, but instead of fixing them, he doubled down, dismissing anyone who questioned him. He turned back to me now, still trying to fight. "And what makes you think you can run this company, huh? You've never worked here a day in your life. You really think you're fit to be president? You're nothing but an outsider." I let out a small chuckle. "You're absolutely right, Grant." He blinked, caught off guard. "I have no intention of running this company," I continued. "I didn't go through all this to take your place. The only reason I'm sitting here right now is to send you a message." Grant's breath hitched. "Your replacement has already been chosen," I told him, my tone final. "A new president was elected by the board, and they've already begun taking over your responsibilities." Silence filled the office. For the first time since I had known him, Grant looked truly defeated. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His eyes darted from the documents in his hands to my face, as if hoping this was all just some bad dream. But this wasn't a dream. This was reality. And for Grant, reality had finally caught up with him. Grant had convinced himself that I had been scheming all along, plotting to take his place as president. "I've told you before, I never wanted that position," I said, my voice steady. "All I care about is protecting the company my father built. He spent his whole life making it what it is, and I won't let his legacy be destroyed." Grant let out a bitter laugh. "And you expect me to believe that?" he scoffed. "Don't try to fool me with your noble act. You're just after the same thing I was, power and money." He didn't understand. He never would. He thought I cared about status and wealth, not the actual heart of what my father had created. For a moment, his face twisted in anger, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. But just as quickly, he took a breath, forcing himself to stay composed. His lips curled into a smirk. "You really think this is over?" he sneered. "Enjoy it while you can." Then, without another word, He stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. That night, something unexpected happened. Lillian had had enough. She tossed divorce papers at Grant, making it clear that their marriage was over. His downfall at the company was one thing, but his behavior, the years of neglect, betrayal, and selfishness, was something she could no longer tolerate. Grant had spent so much time chasing power that he hadn't realized he had already lost everything that truly mattered. The company moved forward without him. A new president was chosen, someone who had worked under my father, someone who genuinely cared about the business and the people in it. I knew the company was in good hands now. My mother and sister felt the same way. None of us wanted to see my father's hard work go to waste. While I was handling the legal matters of Grant's removal, Lillian was preparing to end her marriage. The day she told him, the house felt heavier than ever. Her voice trembled slightly, but she stood her ground. "Why are you turning away from me now?" Grant asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Is it because I lost my title? Is that it? Now that I'm no longer president, you don't care anymore?" Lillian met his gaze with quiet strength. "You think this is about betrayal?" she said. "The only betrayal here is yours. You never loved me. You loved what I represented. The president's daughter. The company's future. But when it came to our home, to our children, to my father when he was dying, you were never there. You only cared about what you could take. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences." Grant had no comeback. He just stood there, silent. Lillian had spent years worrying about her kids, about our father's company, about the life she had built. But in the end, she was stronger than Grant had ever given her credit for. And thanks to what our father left behind, she had enough financial security to take care of her children without him. With the company back in the right hands and Grant out of our lives, we finally had the chance to live in peace. The only concern that lingered was whether Grant would try to retaliate. But he had no power left. He had burned through his money, and, to make matters worse, he had fallen for an investment scam. Some smooth-talking fraudster had convinced him he could turn a quick profit, and Grant, greedy as ever, jumped at the chance. By the time he realized he had been tricked, it was too late. Now he was drowning in debt. It was almost poetic. He had spent years manipulating people for his own gain, and in the end, he had been outplayed by someone just like him. Meanwhile, life became simple again, peaceful. I spent my days looking after my mother and continuing my work at the tutoring school. It was a good life, one I had once taken for granted. And then there was Noah. That kid brought so much joy into our home. He loved being around us, and we loved having him there. He had this energy that reminded me of how things used to be when we were kids, when family mattered more than anything else. One evening, as we sat together, Noah grinned up at us and declared, "When I grow up, I'm going to be a president, just like Grandpa." His words made my mother tear up. Lillian and I exchanged a knowing look, smiling at the innocence in his voice. "You might say that now," I told him, ruffling his hair. "But don't be surprised if you end up wanting to be a teacher when you get older." That made everyone laugh. Noah furrowed his brows, looking serious. "But I'm not very good at studying," he admitted. "I don't think I'd make a good teacher." His honesty only made us laugh harder, not out of mockery, but because it was just so endearing. In that moment, surrounded by family, by love, by warmth, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. I wasn't dwelling on what had been lost, or what could have been. I was finally, truly living in the present.